Hi everyone, welcome to the Secureworks webcast today for the cyber battlefield, analysing cyber threats in 2023 from global conflicts. My name is Aiden Sinnott. I'm a security researcher with the Counter Threat Unit. Before we get into it, I'll just give you a bit of background on myself. I've been with the Secureworks CTU for 3 years now. Prior to that, I was doing threat intel and security consultancy with BAE Systems. And before that, for most of my career, for about 13, 14 years, I was an intelligence analyst with the UK National Crime Agency. So the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit, we, as a research team, we analyse threat data from a range of sources. So from client telemetry, incident response and threat hunting engagements, botnet tracking, our own internal research, third-party reporting, to actively monitor the threat landscape. And then we use a variety of commercial and proprietary tool sets to produce, analyze, and validate threat intelligence. We take our research findings to inform customers and use them across our platforms as well to improve detection and response efforts. And when we do see anomalous activity on these platforms, we then do research on those to try and identify new attack techniques and threats. So before we get into the bulk of the talk today, just a few bits of housekeeping. So today's presentation is going to be recorded, so you can view it again on demand, and it'll be available within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. If you have any questions throughout, there is a Q&A window where you can submit them. So hopefully I should have some time at the end to get through those. Depending on how much time I've got, I might not be able to answer all of them, but any that I don't get through, I'll be able to take offline, and I will get an answer to you offline in slow time. If you experience any technical difficulties, you should see a help widget at the bottom of your screen, so please click that. There are some more resources that are available in the related content widget. So I think we've got the State of the Threat Report 2023. We've got some links to our threat group pages about some of the threat groups we'll talk about today, and a recent blog post on some Iranian hacktivist activity that we're going to cover today. So feel free to have a flick through some of that as well when you get a chance. There's webinar console you're looking at can be customized. You can move or resize any of the windows to suit you. If you happen to accidentally close a window, just click on the widget option at the bottom of your screen. You'll be able to reopen it. If you want to chat to a Secureworks team member, you can use the chat with Secureworks window. And finally, if you have any feedback, please take a moment to complete the quick 3-question survey that you might see in your console. And also you can chat directly with sales through the chat with sales widget. So that's housekeeping out of the way now. I'll move on to the bulk of today's talk and give you a bit of background first on what we're going to talk about. So the two main conflicts that we're going to look at are the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the one between Israel and Hamas. Now, I'm not going to go through the full history of the geopolitics and the conflicts between these groups because it's very long, very complex. But for the purposes of this presentation and understanding how the current cyber activity aligns with kinetic activity, it's just worth giving a quick overview of the two conflicts and the kind of the time period that we're looking at. So start with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We had February 24th, 2022. Russia launched a military invasion of Ukraine following a period of heightened tension in the region. This was the largest attack on a European country since World War II. And by June 2022, Russia occupied about 20% of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine responded with a counteroffensive in August 2022, focusing on the southern front line, retaking Kherson and Kharkiv from Russian forces. And obviously this conflict is ongoing, both kinetic and on the cyber battlefield as well. Meanwhile, so October the 7th, the other conflict that we'll look at, Hamas launched a large number of rocket attacks against Israel, accompanied by Palestinian fighters entering southern Israel by land and air. Many Israeli civilians and soldiers were killed, many more taken to Gaza and held hostage. And as expected, Israel retaliated with a widespread bombing campaign and a vow to obliterate Hamas. And in parallel to this kinetic warfare in both conflicts, CTU researchers have observed a real huge uptick in the number of hacktivist groups emerging on Telegram and various other social media channels, launching attacks which are predominantly DDoS and website defacements, and making claims of hacks against critical national infrastructure, government and military targets. And that's what we're going to look at today. So if we start by looking at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, there've always been hacktivist groups active in this region just because of the history of the conflict. But this activity really ramped up after the October 7th attack. This graphic here is from a security researcher, CyberKnow, and they identified 137 distinct groups in the region, and this is as of 2nd of November. Of these, 118 were pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, and just 19 were pro-Israel. It's worth noting there the distinction between the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel there. It's mainly due to some of the groups involved in the conflict, we'll talk about later, whose involvement stems predominantly from their anti-Israel stance more than their support for Palestine. So we're thinking about some of the Iranian and Russian groups that we'll talk about later when we're talking about kind of the anti-Israel side. And as demonstrated by the graphic, it says in the orange there next to the groups, the kind of their MO, what they're involved in. Most of these groups are involved in DDoS attacks and website defacements, and some performing or claiming to perform hack and leak operations. And the groups tend to fall into three categories. So we'll have groups that are well established and have been active in the region for many years, some new groups that have just emerged since the start of the most recent conflict, and groups from outside the region, some of which may have links to state-sponsored groups, and specifically personas from Russia, Iran, and India. So what do these attacks look like? The vast majority of the attacks we've seen have been low-level DDoS attacks and website defacements, mainly opportunistic in nature, targeting kind of low-hanging fruit, so websites and sites that have kind of poor security controls. The DDoS attacks tend to be short-term, don't have a huge operational impact on the affected organizations. And the website defacements, often they'll just replace the victim's homepage with imagery and messages in support of Palestine. So if you see in the screenshot there, that's just one example of a hacktivist group called a non-ghost. Like many of these groups, they use Telegram extensively for spreading misinformation, propaganda, and making claims of hacks. Just a note of caution for researchers whilst we're on the subject of these Telegram groups. If you are interested in going on and researching these groups and having a look at what they're involved in, just be aware that a lot of these groups, as part of the propaganda and everything else, they do share some very distressing images of war and victims, including children. So just be mindful of that if you do decide to do your own research around these Telegram channels. So another group that I wanted to briefly highlight is GhostSec. They're a well-established hacktivist collective. They've been around since about 2015. And at that time, they were predominantly concerned with tracking and disrupting ISIS-related online propaganda. But more recently, they're one of 5 hacktivist groups that have formed this collective known as the Five Families. And they've been known to conduct attacks against Iran, claiming to have breached an Iranian surveillance system. But in the context of the Israel-Hamas war, they've posted on Telegram their support for Palestine and have claimed attacks on Israeli water systems, PLCs, and various other Israeli targets. Where GhostSec differs slightly from a lot of the other hacktivist groups we see is their activities outside of the kind of regular DDoSing and website defacement. So they've advertised a service known as Ghostly Development, offering custom malware development. They've created a GitHub repository and a Telegram channel called the New Blood Project, which contains lots of information and resources for anyone wishing to learn how to undertake hacktivist campaigns or hacking or attacks against various ICS devices, things like that. And they've also released the GhostLocker ransomware as a service product, which, whilst I don't think we've seen it yet in attacks against Israel, is one to keep an eye on. Slightly more advanced than some of the hacktivist groups we do see. But one feature common across a lot of these groups is the desire to appear far more capable than they actually are. So the Telegram channels, when we're looking at those, we see them being used to make claims of major hacks impacting critical national infrastructure, government, military targets, stealing information, all sorts of outlandish claims. So we've got a few examples here. The first two are claims made by a non-ghost. So the first one there, they claim to have breached Israel's Iron Dome system. This is Israel's mobile all-weather air defense system, so it's designed to intercept and destroy short-range rockets and artillery shells. This would have been a major cyber attack with a significant impact, not something that a hacktivist group likely has the capability for. And as expected, there was no evidence to suggest that this was successful. The second claim there is the breach of the Israel's Red Alert app. So this is an app that's used to alert Israeli citizens to incoming airstrikes. And whilst this appears to have some success, so I think they exploited a vulnerability in the API, which allowed them to intercept requests and send fake notifications. And I think they did send a notification claiming that a nuclear bomb was incoming. The actual impact of the breach appears to have been minimal. I think the app was removed fairly quickly from app stores, and it didn't have a huge number of users. So again, the actual impact didn't quite match the Hyperbole put out on their Telegram channel and the claims they made. And a third example was a group called ThreatSec. Unusually, they've claimed that they neither support Hamas or Israel, but are anti-war, so they're hacking both sides. And this, again, quite an audacious claim. They've stated that they've taken out one of the biggest ISPs in the Gaza Strip, and they had control over the company's servers and TV station systems. The reality, which was confirmed by AlphaNet after the attack, was that the outages in their network were a result of physical damage to their buildings and equipment caused by the bombing campaigns. But this image here and this case study here is one example about how these quite outlandish claims can gather traction and cause a disproportionate amount of concern around these groups. So this particular example here, this is from a hacktivist group called IROX team. They're pro-Palestinian. And following the October 7th attack by Hamas, they declared a cyber war on Israel and all those who support Israel. On their Telegram channel, as you can see from the screenshot there, they provided dates which corresponded to 3 waves of attacks against countries that support Israel. And understandably, this post was picked up on and reported by many news outlets and security researchers on X and various others. But this amplifies the threat and adds a veneer of legitimacy to the claims. So as you can see from the screenshot here, for the IROX team in the bottom right-hand corner there, and this is the original message about the cyber war on their Telegram channel, it received 68 views there, and that was around lunchtime on October 19th. This compares to approximately 40,000 views, plus hundreds of likes and retweets for the posts that were then made by the security researchers on X, kind of highlighting the threat and publicizing the news. And so understandably, these messages then get picked up by security teams and organizations who won't have any context around it. And quite a few of those will reach out to the CTU for advice because they're understandably worried about what may happen, especially if they operate in the countries listed. So the reality, obviously we had a number of customers come to us and ask us about this threat. So we undertook some research into this group, and it showed that the reality was actually quite different to what they were posting. They just had a few hundred subscribers to their Telegram channel prior to that post. And it was originally created in September 2023, and at the time was concerned with selling Indian credit card details, a few website databases, so mainly kind of Indian website databases, Indian colleges, things like that. So fairly low level fraud. We continue to monitor this group. Obviously, they've made claims that they were going to have this cyber war against these countries on these dates. So we had a duty to continue to monitor the activity of the group, specifically on the dates they highlighted. And again, the reality really exposed the lack of technical sophistication within the group. And although there were attacks on some organizations on the dates that they posted, the dates they claimed, and the countries listed, they were fairly unsophisticated, low-level website defacements. And the sites they attacked were predominantly small businesses with poor website security control. So I think there was a Brazilian restaurant, an optometrist, and a small legal firm, amongst others. And again, they'd all been defaced with the screenshot there, the message shown on the right, hacked by IROX team. Similar to what we see in a lot of the other website defacements. The actual impact on the companies was minimal, and this was repeated on the on the other dates posted as well. So in this particular example, we were able to assess that the IROX team posed a minimal threat to Secureworks customers, and they didn't really have the capability to conduct the kind of sophisticated intrusions or disruptive attacks. But this is a useful example of how even these kind of low-level hacktivist groups can incite fear and panic through their posts, and quite often the hyperbole and the claims of massive attacks against CNI, the claims themselves and the headlines they generate can often be more impactful and more disruptive than the actual DDoS attacks themselves. So, and it does make it difficult to track kind of which groups are involved when you've got all these groups making all of these different claims. So we'll look at some external involvement in the region. So given the historical geopolitics of the region, it's not really any surprise to know that there are hacktivist groups and various other groups from outside the region that have become involved in the conflict. These groups are predominantly from Russia, Iran, and India. They're well established and in many cases have been active for many years. Just to give an example of some of these groups, we've got Anonymous Sudan and Killnet, both of which are Russian-speaking groups. And on the Iranian side, Moses Staff, there's Abraham's Axe as well, and the Indian Cyber Force is another group. The Russian and Iranian groups here are both post content and claim attacks in support of Palestine, whereas the ICF have conducted attacks in support of Israel. If we start looking at some of the Iranian groups' involvements in the Israel-Hamas conflict, so Iran and Israel have been involved in a proxy war since the mid-80s. Iran have provided weapons and training to groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all of whom have carried out attacks on Israel. And this proxy war is mirrored in the cyber world, with Iran using hacktivist personas to conduct attacks. So going back quite a long way back to 2012, there was hacktivist groups calling themselves the Cutting Sword of Justice and the Arab Youth Group. They took responsibility for the Shamoon malware attacks on Saudi Aramco and Razgas. They were quite high-profile attacks. In 2020, there was a group called Pay to Key, and they emerged as a hack and leak group, compromising various Israeli companies. And that was followed shortly by the Networm campaign, which again had several similarities to the Pay to Key group. CT Research has associated both of these groups, Pay to Key and Networm, to an Iranian threat group that we track as Cobalt Foxglove. More recently, there's been hacktivist personas Moses Staff, Abraham's Axe, and the Cyber Avengers, amongst others, made claims of attacks against Israeli critical national infrastructure, including railways, oil refineries, water treatment plants, and SCADA systems. Moses Staff and Abraham's Axe have got several similarities, and CTU researchers assess those as being operated by the Iranian Cobalt Sapling threat group. More information on these profiles and these threat groups are available on the Secureworks website. I think actually in the resources section as well, we've got a link to those threat profiles. Cyber Avengers as well have been making headlines recently as well. They've been responsible for a number of compromises of ICS HMI devices made by Unitronics, an Israeli company. And so we put out a blog post on that recently. Again, that should be linked in the resources section and available on our website. More recently, this activity has continued. So this is the pro-Palestinian Malik team. They emerged in October, announcing the compromise of a private college in Israel, leaking details of hundreds of thousands of students, college documents, some CCTV videos from the college campus. And we assess with moderate confidence that this is Malik team, and likely a false persona operated by the Iranian threat group Cobalt Shadow. Another notable recent attack on Israeli companies featured a new Linux malware called Bibi Linux Wiper, where there's a Windows version available as well. And we assessed that this malware was likely in use by hacktivists associated with Iran, with wipers such as this historically being used predominantly in politically motivated attacks. But these groups we've covered here is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of Iranian hacktivist involvement in the Israel-Hamas war. Iran have got lots of experience and a long history in conducting proxy cyber warfare against Israel, using hacktivist and criminal personas, and they even use external Iranian cyber companies such as Emanet Pasagad to conduct attacks on their behalf. So it's no surprise to see them heavily involved in this conflict. If we look on the Russian hacktivism side, so the two that we've mentioned so far are Killnet and Anonymous Sudan, who are two of the most high-profile groups. Both have a significant number of followers across their Telegram and social media accounts, numbering in the tens of thousands. Despite this, they too have a tendency to embellish details of their attacks and take credit for disruptions in which they had little involvement. Recently, in the last few days, last week or so, there was a message put out by Killnet, or by Kill Milk, who was the original founder and I suppose spokesperson and face of Killnet, saying that he had handed the reins over to a different group and he was stepping back. And there were some various claims that they were no longer going to be doing politically motivated hacking. But I did see them try and take the glory for the recent, I think just the last 24 hours, actually, the attack on the Ukrainian mobile operator Kyivstar, likely Russian state. I think that was the assessment coming out. But again, Killnet posted on their Telegram channel that this is something that they were responsible for. So fits in their MO of trying to take credit for disruptions in which they had little involvement. Another example was back in June, where Killnet and Anonymous Sudan threatened destructive cyber attacks against European banks, US banks, the SWIFT financial system, and the US Federal Reserve. The intention, according to them, was to disrupt the flow of money and funding of weapons to Ukraine. As you'd expect, these threats spawned all sorts of headlines in mainstream media and loads of questions from customers about, what was the risk? What did we assess the risk? Was this likely to impact them? But actually amounted to very little in the end, with no evidence that there were any successful attacks taking place. Now these groups have waded into the Israel-Hamas conflict. They've sided with Palestine, and they're making claims of DDoS attacks against some fairly large organizations such as CNN, Yahoo, PayPal, and they regularly also post videos containing disinformation and threats against supporters of Israel. It is worth noting here the number of views. If you look at the screenshots here, if you remember the IROX team post where it had 68 views, I think, the one we discussed earlier, these posts by these groups regularly gain upwards of 40 or 50,000 views. So these two groups are very influential when they're putting out all their claims and their disinformation. And there's also strong links between many of these Russian hacktivist groups and the state. So earlier this year, there were 3 pro-Russian hacktivist groups, Zacnet Team, InfoCenter, and Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, who observed leaking data on Telegram that had been stolen from Ukrainian victims of APT-28, some wiper attacks which would just occur 24 hours earlier. So APT-28 are associated with the Russian main intelligence directorate, the GRU, and included in one of the leaks by these so-called hacktivist groups was a technical artifact from an APT-28 intrusion. So there are strong links between these hacktivist groups and the state, whether they are working together, supported, or proxies. There is close links there. So whilst we're on the subject of Russia and the Russian groups, just turn our attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, look at how the cyber battlefield here has kind of evolved alongside the kinetic warfare. And again, we've got some research here from CyberKnow. In this particular conflict, they've identified 154 groups active in the region, 93 of which are pro-Russia and 61 are pro-Ukraine. It's worth noting here that in this cyber tracker, it doesn't just look at hacktivist groups, but also government organizations which have either pledged support. So on the pro-Ukraine side, we've got the UK NCSC and US Cybercom listed. And on the pro-Russia side, the APT groups you would expect. So Iron Twilight, Iron Viking, all the main Russian APTs. And this particular conflict is a slightly different dynamic than the Israel-Hamas war that we've just covered. It's more traditional in the sense that it's being waged by 2 states, both of which have got access to quite sophisticated cyber capabilities at their disposal. So if we look at the kind of 3 phases of this Russia-Ukraine war to date, the first phase covers the first 3 months parallel to Russia's military invasion at the start of 2022. So the invasion was on February 24th with the goal of conquering Ukraine and replacing its government. It's worth noting that prior to this, there would have been a sustained period of cyber espionage and activity in planning for the invasion. There was an initial focus on destructive wiper attacks using malware such as Whispergate, Foxblade, S-Delete, among others. And at the same time, online influence campaigns are being used to justify the invasion and undermine the Ukrainian government. So fake videos of alleged Ukrainian attacks, propaganda, and claims that US were creating bioweapons in Ukraine and the likes. Phase 2 covers March 2022 to September 22. So the Russian threat group started to target logistics and transportation sector inside Ukraine. And this coincided with a kinetic campaign during which there were missile strikes launched against Ukrainian transportation infrastructure. So there's obviously a strategy there to disrupt the flow of weapons and support services inside the country. A number of cyber espionage campaigns were launched, mainly organizations providing humanitarian and military assistance to Ukraine, so phishing campaigns, and an increase in propaganda efforts targeting populations within occupied Ukrainian territory, so attempting to spread fear amongst the Ukrainian people, and quite often aligning with the kinetic activity as well. So we saw when there was fighting that hit the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. There was a lot of Russian propaganda around that about the potential for a nuclear attacks or nuclear disaster because of what the Ukrainian forces were doing in the area. Excuse me. And the final phase, the third phase that we kind of broke this down into, was starting in September 2022, with Russia launching missile attacks against critical energy infrastructure throughout Ukraine's major cities. And in parallel to that, wiper attacks on the cyber side being launched by the Russian threat groups, targeting that same civilian power and water infrastructure, phishing campaigns targeting those involved outside Ukraine in supply chains for kind of Western defense-related organizations, likely for intelligence collection purposes, and an increasing use of hacktivist personas and pro-Russian online groups, kind of spreading propaganda and disinformation through Telegram and other social media channels. If we look at the Ukraine side and the main hacktivist groups involved in this war, there's probably three main hacktivist groups that we'll look at. Starting in the middle there, the IT Army of Ukraine. Unlike many of the hacktivist groups we've already mentioned, they were launched 2 days after the Russian invasion by the Ukrainian government. So they sit somewhere between the standalone groups that sprung up on Telegram and the state-backed proxy groups that we see from Iran. They've recruited members from outside of Ukraine, and there's reports that Ukraine kind of offered them training and equipment to enable them to perform DDoS attacks, of which they performed over 600, I think, to date against Russian organizations. And their evolution over the past year or so is really notable. The Center for International and Strategic Studies recently described them as an organization that had quietly transformed from an ad hoc group of volunteers into a tightly organized operation with ongoing support from Ukrainian government officials, tens of thousands of international participants, and industry-leading tools. So a really notable evolution of that group there. On the left, we have the Ukrainian Cyber Alliance. That's another major group formed in 2016. They were an amalgamation of various smaller groups uniting for a common cause of countering Russian aggression. And they've been active in cyber operations against Russia for almost 10 years. And they made headlines this year when they were responsible for taking down the Trigona ransomware leak site and claimed to have wiped out 10 of their servers and exfiltrated data about the operation. And finally, on the right, we have the Cyber Anarchy Squad. They've been described as Ukraine's response to KillNet. Been around since 2022. They established an online forum called Dumps, where they had various database dumps and they discussed operations. They started with fairly low-level attacks, not a major impact. In 2023, however, they did breach an organization called Infotel, which provided much of the backbone for Russia's banking infrastructure, allegedly disabling them for 33 hours, so having quite a major impact there by all accounts. So given that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is about 18 months odd further along than the war between Israel and Hamas, it's worthwhile just looking to see if there are any parallels that we can draw or any common patterns that might provide an indication of how activism and hacktivism might evolve in the context of the Israeli-Hamas war. So the quote on screen now is from an interview given earlier this year by Andriy Baranovich, who's a spokesperson for the Ukraine Cyber Alliance, and they spoke on their experience at the outset of the war with Russia and how this had changed over time. And what they noted was that at the start of the conflict, immediately following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was a huge number of what he described as school children rushing to Telegram to announce that a new powerful APT group has been created. And then they would post a database with a few hundred entries or claims of having hacked a village council website. And that kind of chimes with what we're seeing with the pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups, the large number of groups, no real affiliation, making all sorts of outlandish claims. And the spokesperson here described this period as chaos, not knowing who was responsible for what or which groups people belonged to, and everyone acting under pseudonyms. And they said that this chaos lasted for about a year, after which the first wave of excitement subsided, and it just left behind those groups that were committed to working to the end and saw this as a mission rather than a hobby. And it's something we may see in the conflict in the Middle East over the next year. Of course, it's difficult to draw too many conclusions from this. Hamas doesn't have the support and resources provided by the Ukrainian government to kind of coordinate and direct multiple disparate groups into a single cohesive force that they can direct and work with. But I think the general trend of smaller groups realizing that they're having minimal impact and low-level attacks and interest waning and larger groups taking center stage means it's probably likely that we'll see the hacktivist seen shrink to a smaller number of more determined and capable groups over the next year. So, assessment of the threat. So, as we've shown on the previous slides, the involvement of Russian Iranian hacktivists, some of which got suspected ties to state-sponsored groups, adds to the complexity of the online activity surrounding the Israel-Hamas conflict. It's quite difficult with the sheer number of groups in the region, the fluid interactions between them, and the nature of the audacious claims to identify which groups pose the greatest threats. And one common feature is their relatively low level of sophistication. We assessed that none of the groups operating in support of Hamas posed a cyber capability to launch globally disruptive attacks. And whilst there may be some elevated risk to non-Israeli entities that hacktivists consider to be prominent supporters of Israel, they'll likely take the form of DDoS attacks and disinformation campaigns. Given a lot of these sensational headlines that are generated, we do expect that some customers and people may be concerned and come to us for advice or guidance specific to their business. But in general, there's no specific guidance or recommendation beyond maintaining proper cybersecurity hygiene and controls for organizations operating in Israel. Recommend considering the risk that a denial of service attack may present to your operations and engaging with a DDoS mitigation service if appropriate. In contrast, the Russian government does remain a top cyber threat as it refines and employs its espionage, influence, and attack capabilities. So any organizations associated with international policy, military information, or those whose actions or messaging may antagonize the Russian government, particularly in the current context of the war with Ukraine, should be particularly vigilant and be prepared for potential attacks. Likewise, organizations that operate or have an integrated supply chains in former Soviet countries and countries where Russia is militarily active have a heightened risk of being collateral victims of disruptive or destructive attacks. So to strengthen operational resilience against Russian state-sponsored cyber activity, CT researchers recommend prioritizing patching of known exploited vulnerabilities, implementing and enforcing the use of multi-factor authentication, securing and monitoring instances of RDP and other potentially risky services, and providing end-user cybersecurity awareness and training. Obviously, none of these are specific to the Russian threat. They just represent good cyber hygiene that hopefully all organizations should be practicing. So that brings us to the end of the presentation today. For anyone interested in finding out more, we've produced some blog posts. The State of the Nation, State of the Threat Reports 2023 is available on our website and through the resources panel. Threat group profiles on some of the Iranian and Russian threat groups, as well as cyber criminal groups that we've mentioned in this presentation, are available on our website. They're linked as well in the resources section. Thank you for your time. I'm just going to have a quick check of the Q&A section to see if there is anything in there. I think I've probably overrun by a minute, but I'll just see. I'll just see if I can answer a couple of, or maybe one question to see how much time we've got. Recent attacks by cyber avengers and escalation in activity by hacktivist groups. I'll answer that one because we've done some work on it recently. So the cyber avengers are a hacktivist group that are associated to the Iranian state, the IRGC. They made headlines recently. They attacked a water treatment plant in the US. So in terms of whether this is an escalation, it's kind of yes and no. It's not an escalation in terms of capability. It's still they're still fairly low-level scan and exploit attacks. The devices they have attacked have been kind of open on the internet. But I suppose it's an escalation in terms of, you know, it's still critical national infrastructure in the US, and that's still quite a bold move that will put them in the sights and of the authorities. So it's an escalation certainly in terms of targeting, but not necessarily in terms of technical capability. Let's see. I think I've got time for one. I think I've got about a minute left, so I'll quickly squeeze in one more. On the slide covering main groups in the Israel-Hamas conflict, why there's so few pro-Israel hacktivist groups compared to the large number of pro-Palestine groups. So on the number of hacktivist groups in the region, I think it was 119 or something pro-Palestine and just 19 pro-Israel. Firstly, the targeting is very different. So the kind of bombing campaigns across Palestine has already destroyed a lot of the critical national infrastructure, a lot of the systems and companies that may have been targets already. But also, I think in terms of Israel and those individuals within Israel who have the skills and capability and motivation to conduct this kind of attacks. Obviously, they have the military service. So I think from the ages of kind of 16 to 18, they'll be their skills will be assessed and they'll be recruited. And the army has the Unit 8200 in the Israeli Defense Force, which is responsible for a lot of SIGINT and cyber warfare work. So anyone kind of that age where they might be looking to get into hacktivism or perform attacks against Palestine or Hamas on behalf of Israel, more than likely they're going to be doing that for the IDF rather than on behalf of setting up a hacktivist group where, with the Israeli Defense Force, they got access to all the tools and equipment and training that they might need. So that's probably the main reason that we see for that. That is 5 minutes, just over our 30 minutes now. So there are a few more questions in the Q&A. I will get to those and respond to those offline. So if you have asked a question, I will get an answer to you. But thank you for your time today. I hope you found it useful and interesting. As I said, if you are interested, there's more resources available on our website. But have a great rest of the week. Thank you for attending. Goodbye.
That was a great webcast. Congratulations.